Okay, I gotta call you back. I'm about to have Bible study.
Why?
Because I'm saved. And I read the word. Because it's important to know the word. How's we gonna battle all these demons and witchcraft? How's you gonna do it?
There are other books.
Girl, get off of my phone, girlfriend. Get off of my phone. I'll call you back.
I mean, that book was written by a racist white
girl, goodbye, girl. I'll call you in an hour. Y'all, let me get out of the mama. She be on the same where we can read.
When Tamar spoke this time, it wasn't noise. It wasn't another messy rant fans could scroll past and laugh at. Her words cut deeper. They had weight, intention, and a darkness that felt like confession. She didn't sound like a woman chasing attention. She sounded like a woman who had already broken down, already stitched herself back together, and finally decided to peel off the bandages so the world could see the scars. This wasn't performance. This was testimony. And at the center of that testimony wasn't fame, music, or gossip. It was family. She painted the early picture everyone thought they already knew. A preacher father guiding his daughters with sermons and hymns, a mother running rehearsals with military precision, and 5 sisters raised under the roof of church discipline. From the outside, it looked like a miracle. Little girls harmonizing in pews who grew into women harmonizing on stages. The Braxton name was supposed to symbolize faith, unity, and destiny fulfilled. But as Tamar began to speak, she pressed on the seams of that story, forcing everyone to look closer. Because hidden inside that picture-perfect success was a silence no one had ever explained. And that silence belonged to Traci. According to Tamar, it wasn't random that Traci was always pushed to the side. It wasn't bad luck that her voice rarely made it to the front mic. She suggested it was structural, that there had been a decision made. One sister would carry the burden so the others could carry the brand. And when she used the word sacrifice, the internet froze. Because that word changes everything. It doesn't sound like sibling rivalry anymore. It sounds like a deal. It sounds like somebody paid the price so the spotlight could keep shining. And the one who paid, she insisted, was Traci. Suddenly, the reruns looked different. What once seemed like petty banter, shady jokes, and exaggerated reality TV drama now looked like receipts. Every time Traci was laughed at for being difficult, every time she was excluded from a scene, every time she was called the outsider, it no longer looked like coincidence. It looked like evidence. And Tamar's voice shook when she said it. Her sister had been treated like collateral, not kin. She described how in her own life she turned to prayer as an anchor when everything else felt chaotic. She leaned into faith, built prayer circles, and tried to hold on to God as her sanity slipped. But instead of support, she says she was mocked. Not by strangers, but by her own sisters. Tamar remembered her Bible study groups being ridiculed, her prayer hands being laughed at, her surrender moments turned into punchlines. She accused Toni, the very sister who once built her reputation on gospel roots, of dismissing scripture as a book written by racist men. For Tamar, that wasn't a disagreement. That was sabotage. Imagine clinging to God just to stay alive and being laughed at by your own blood. That's not family conflict. That's betrayal, and fans connected the dots. They remembered Toni's own memoir, where she admitted to faking speaking in tongues as a child to please her parents. That revelation, combined with Tamar's live, reframed everything. One sister leaned harder into faith, the other allegedly mocked it. And in the middle was Traci, a woman who clung to God quietly, even as her role in the family shrank smaller and smaller. The haunting part came when Tamar tied her own near-death spirals to this culture of dismissal. She described waking up injured, bleeding, with gaps in her memory and missing teeth. She implied it wasn't coincidence that these breakdowns happened whenever she tried to break the silence. She called them signals. Warnings that speaking too loud, praying too boldly, resisting too openly came with consequences. And fans, instead of brushing it off this time, started connecting the dots. The shaved head, the breakdowns, the cryptic posts, the hospitalizations. None of it looked random anymore. It looked like a pattern, and that pattern lined up disturbingly with Traci's life. When Traci needed her family most, when she battled illness, when she cried for respect, she wasn't met with comfort. She was met with cameras. She was met with branding. And when she passed away, Tamar now suggested the grief wasn't carried with honesty, but polished into PR moments for public consumption. Tamar's language shook fans because it forced them to see the Braxton family story not as a gospel fairy tale, but as a survival economy. In her telling, loyalty was bought with silence, and those who broke the silence were punished. She claimed Towanda only answered the phone when cameras were rolling. That real connection was withheld as a form of control. She remembered outsiders barging into her prayer spaces, sacred moments turned into leaks for blogs. Even faith itself, she claimed, was monitored and mocked if it didn't serve the larger narrative. And at the center of that system, she placed Toni, the glamorous face of the family, the one who cashed in on credibility while Traci was left to carry the pain. For fans who loved Toni's music, it created a conflict. Tamar wasn't asking people to hate her sister. She was asking them to see the cost. She said it wasn't about bad timing or unlucky breaks, it was deliberate. Traci wasn't forgotten. She was chosen to be excluded. And that's why the word sacrifice hurt so badly. If that's true, then every standing ovation, every Grammy, every trophy sits under a shadow. Every glittering moment is tainted with the question, whose suffering made this possible? And Tamar didn't let herself off the hook. She admitted she had been messy, reactive, sharp. She said her breakdowns weren't graceful and her responses weren't perfect. But she argued that none of that justified silence. Families aren't measured by how loudly they clap on stage, she said. They're measured by whether they lift you up when you can't stand. And when she collapsed, she said the silence from her sisters roared louder than any applause. Fans remembered the social media posts, the birthday wishes, the polite captions. Tamar said those weren't love. Those were optics. PR gestures dressed up as affection. If love is real, she argued, it shows up in private, not just online. The heaviest moment came when she circled back to Traci's final years. A woman of undeniable talent, battling illness with grace, still begging for respect. Tamar remembered how her sister cried on camera about being excluded, how her pain was turned into storylines. And now, with her gone, she demanded people stop calling it sibling bickering. Call it what it was, a system that fed itself on one sister's silence. That, Tamar said, is why she speaks now, even if it costs her everything. Because in her eyes, Traci was the lamb. A life sacrifice so the rest could keep eating. And if silence killed Traci, then silence could kill her too. When Tamar went live again, she didn't sound like a woman ranting for attention. She sounded like someone keeping a promise. She had already told the world that Traci's silence wasn't random, that her faith had been mocked, that her own pain was punished whenever she tried to pray too loudly. But now, she pulled the thread deeper, connecting her own trauma to her sister's erasure. She opened with a haunting question. Why is it that every time she leaned closer to God, chaos followed? Why did Bible studies end in mockery, prayer circles end in sabotage, and faith itself become a punchline in her own family? For her, it wasn't bad luck. It was proof. Proof that the moment she stopped playing along with the script, she became a threat. And when she became a threat, the consequences were brutal. She recounted the hospitalizations, the overdose scare, the breakdowns the public already knew. But she added details no one had heard. She described waking up bruised, bleeding, with gaps in memory so sharp they felt intentional. She called those moments warnings, not accidents. Not coincidence, but retaliation. Signals that speaking too much came with punishment. And she said what hurt the most was not the pain itself, but the silence that followed. She cried out for comfort, but what came back wasn't compassion. It was distance. That silence, she insisted, told its own story. She wasn't being protected. She was being isolated. Fans listening began to connect the dots again, this time with Traci. They remembered how often she sat quietly on set while her sisters bickered. How many times her pleas for respect were brushed off with laughter. How often she was branded angry when she was simply desperate to be heard. To Tamar, these weren't bad edits. They were the blueprint. Traci was the test case, the first to be sidelined, the first to be sacrificed. And once she was gone, the system shifted its focus. The next target became Tamar herself. She turned her words toward Towanda, not out of hate, but exhaustion. She described how Towanda could talk to the other sisters daily, but leave her messages unanswered for weeks. To Tamar, that wasn't oversight. That was punishment. A quiet form of exile that left her questioning her own worth. Silence, she said, is sharper than words. It's a weapon. And when families learn to use silence as control, it becomes more dangerous than any argument. It's rejection without confrontation, a cruelty so subtle it eats at the soul. And then she turned once more toward Toni. Not just as her sister, but as a symbol. She reminded fans that Toni herself admitted in her memoir that she once faked speaking in tongues to please her parents, that church felt suffocating, that faith had been a performance for her as a child. Pair that with her alleged dismissal of Tamar's Bible study, and the picture becomes darker. A woman who once pretended faith to survive childhood now mocked anyone who leaned on faith in adulthood. For Tamar, that wasn't just about religion. It was about power. That wasn't just about religion. It was about power. If faith is mocked, then obedience is demanded. And if obedience is demanded, rebellion is punished. The irony burned. To the world, Toni was the polished star, the Grammy-winning legend, the face of the Braxton name. But in Tamar's telling, she was also the enforcer of an unspoken bargain. One sister shines, another suffers. One builds a career, another is erased. And when Tamar tried to flip that script, when she tried to tell the truth, the same machinery that erased Traci came for her too. That was why she used the word cult. Not for drama, but because she believed silence, control, and sacrifice were the pillars holding the Braxton legacy together. Fans didn't dismiss her this time. They pulled receipts. They dug up old clips where Traci cried about being excluded, interviews where she admitted she felt left out, reunion specials where her tears were met with laughter. When paired with Tamar's words, those clips no longer looked like reality TV. They looked like documentation. And when people replayed moments where Toni rolled her eyes at Tamar's faith or dismissed her breakdowns, the scenes no longer looked like sibling teasing. They looked like strategy, a way to keep the system intact. The most heartbreaking part of her live came when she spoke about Traci's final wishes. She claimed that all her sister wanted before she died was one last moment of unity, to sing together with her sisters, the way they were always meant to. But that never happened. The silence was never broken, the circle never repaired. And when Traci passed, the chance was gone forever. To Tamar, that was the ultimate proof. Love had conditions, legacy meant more than healing, and one sister's heart was sacrificed for the image of the rest. She didn't spare herself either. She admitted she had been turned into the scapegoat. Every breakdown she endured was spun into proof that she was unstable. Every hospital stay became evidence against her. Every cry for help was turned into a headline instead of a hug. And yet, she argued, her pain was never about her alone. It was connected to the system that had already devoured Traci. That was why she refused to stay silent. Because silence, she believed, was a death sentence. Tamar described how her most sacred moments were sabotaged. She remembered when her prayer circle was infiltrated, how something meant to be holy was turned into gossip. She said it showed her that even her most private spaces weren't safe. And when Toni allegedly refused to hold hands in prayer, it didn't just sting. It confirmed everything she feared. That unity was for show. That the circle was already broken. Her confession widened beyond her family. She hinted that what happened inside her home mirrored what happens in the industry at large. Stars controlled, faith mocked, individuality erased, sacrifices demanded to keep the machine alive. And when she shaved her head, when she posted cryptic symbols, when she whispered about demons and witchcraft, she said it wasn't drama. It was signaling. Signaling that she was trapped in the same system, that her sisters weren't just participants, but part of the mechanism. By now, fans weren't just listening. They were terrified. They compared Tamar's story to other artists who had spoken about being controlled. They looked at her breakdowns, her hospital visits, her cryptic messages, and they saw patterns. And suddenly, what once seemed like exaggeration began to look like evidence. The most painful irony was that while Tamar clung to God to survive, her own sisters allegedly mocked her for it. While Traci leaned quietly on faith in her last days, she too was left to fight alone. That's why the word sacrifice hit so hard, because it didn't sound metaphorical anymore. It sounded literal. It sounded like accusation. She ended her live with a chilling warning. She was still holding back. She said the world hadn't heard the worst yet. That what had come out so far, the mocked prayers, the sabotage circles, the unexplained injuries, was only the beginning. She said when the time was right, she would tell everything. And the way her voice shook, not with rage but with fear, made fans shiver. If this was just the surface, what could possibly be worse? Her promise left the internet unsettled. People couldn't stop asking, what truths could she be holding back that terrified her so much? The fear in her tone made it clear. Whatever it wasn't distant. It was personal. It was close. And as her words spread, the world began re-watching years of Braxton footage, not with entertainment in mind, but with suspicion. Every smile looked rehearsed. Every hug looked scripted. Every silence looked weaponized. By the time Tamar returned once more, the world wasn't listening with curiosity anymore. It was listening with dread. She had already shaken people by saying Traci's silence wasn't random, that faith had been mocked, that pain had been punished, and that every breakdown in her life was part of a larger pattern. She had connected her scars to her sister's erasure, but now, in her final round of confessions, she shifted the weight of her words. No longer was she just exposing betrayal. She was warning that the story wasn't finished. What people thought was the end of the Braxton tragedy, she insisted, might only be the beginning. She revisited the way grief was handled when Traci passed. To fans, it looked dignified. Polished tributes, heartfelt interviews, carefully curated memories. But to Tamar, it felt hollow. She said the photos and captions didn't match the silence she remembered in the hospital. She said the legacy branding didn't match the lack of presence when it mattered most. And that was the problem, she argued. Families who worship image over intimacy know how to perform unity, but they don't know how to practice it. For her, the betrayal wasn't just that Traci was left out in life. It was that even in death, the truth was dressed up so nobody would question the narrative. She confessed that grief had made her reckless. She admitted there were nights when she didn't think she would make it, mornings when she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. But grief also gave her clarity. It stripped away illusions. It forced her to see that the same culture that excluded Traci was the one that had silenced her, hospitalized her, mocked her faith, and left her doubting herself. And she vowed she would not let the story close politely with hashtags and interviews. She said it had to be told raw, even if it meant burning every bridge. Then she dropped something heavier. She said what people had seen so far, the sabotaged prayer circles, the mockery of faith, the injuries, the isolation, was only the surface. Beneath it, she hinted, were darker truths she still wasn't ready to reveal. "I can't wait until I can tell y'all," she repeated, her voice trembling, not with anger, but with fear. That single line sent shivers down timelines, because if what she had already revealed was this devastating, what could possibly be worse? The fear in her tone made it clear. Whatever it was personal and it was close. She spoke about control, about how even families can become prisons. She said the Braxton name had been both a blessing and a curse, a passport to fame, but also a chain around her neck. Every smile on camera, every reunion hug, every moment of sisterhood was rehearsed to keep the brand alive. And if one sister refused to comply, she was branded unstable, excluded, or erased. She said Traci was the first to pay that price, and she feared she might be next. Not just in reputation, but in survival. She told fans that every time she got close to exposing more, something happened. Another collapse, another hospitalization, another silence that nearly killed her. "Every time I get close," she warned, "something tries to take me out. The internet exploded with theories. People went back to old episodes, looking for signs of scripting and manipulation. They replayed clips of Toni dismissing her faith, of Tawanda ignoring her messages, of Traci sitting in tears while the others laughed. And suddenly those clips didn't feel like entertainment anymore. They felt like warnings everyone had missed. She reminded fans of the day she shaved her head. The moment had been dissected endlessly, but she finally explained, it wasn't fashion. It wasn't shock value. It was freedom. It was baptism. A way to reclaim her body from a system that kept trying to own it. Contracts, obligations, family pressures, spiritual battles. She said shaving her head was the only way she could wash off the lies. And yet, even that act of desperation was mocked by some of her own sisters. That mockery didn't just hurt, it confirmed her deepest fear. The circle was already broken. Love in her family was conditional, measured by compliance, not compassion. Her voice shook as she spoke about her fans. Strangers had become her lifeline. She said people she had never met prayed harder for her survival than some of her own blood. When she collapsed, it was the prayers of fans that kept her alive, not the scripted well wishes from her family. That's why she said she would never stop telling the story, because silence had already taken Traci, and silence had nearly taken her. Speaking, she said, was the only thing that could keep her alive now, and then came the most devastating part. She turned back to Toni, not to demonize her, but to call her tragic. She said Toni was a woman who had gained the world but lost her foundation. A woman who could fill arenas but couldn't sit in a prayer circle. A woman who held Grammys but, in Tamar's eyes, couldn't hold her sister when it mattered most. She said it plainly. What good is success if it costs your blood? That question echoed online for days because deep down, fans knew there was no easy answer. Finally, she spoke directly to Traci, her voice breaking. She said her sister was more than the outsider label she had been given. She was power, voice, and presence. She said the world only saw glimpses of her greatness, but not nearly enough. And she swore she would never let her be remembered as the sister left behind. She would be remembered as the sister sacrificed. That word again, sacrifice, the word that refuses to let the world look away. She closed her live with a warning not just to her family but to anyone listening. Secrets, she said, always destroy from the inside. Legacies built on silence always collapse. And truth always finds a way to speak, whether through the living or the dead. She left the world with one question, hanging heavy like thunder before a storm. If Traci was the sacrifice, if Tamar is now the target, then who will the system come for next? Fans sat with that question like a weight on their chest. Because once you start seeing patterns of sacrifice, you can't unsee them. Every trophy looks different. Every reunion hug looks suspicious. Every polished smile feels rehearsed. And the Braxton legacy, once celebrated as harmony, now sits under suspicion as tragedy. As the live ended, the image of Tamar lingered. Tired, bruised, but unafraid. She had risked her health, her career, her relationships, maybe even her life, just to say what nobody else would. And whether people believed her or not, one thing had become undeniable. The Braxton story would never be the same again.